Module 3.2 will look at the impact of climate change on energy infrastructure in Suriname. What is the energy infrastructure landscape in Suriname? The main energy sources in Suriname are fuel, for example, oil, gas, kerosene, and diesel, which are primarily used in the transportation sector. Electricity, mostly used in households and industries. Electricity in Suriname is usually transmitted over long distances by transmission lines. Liquefied petroleum gas is also used by coastal households for cooking. And finally, biomass, for example, wood, is used in the interior of Suriname for cooking and thermal energy. Suriname has 3 major thermal power plants, 1 hydropower plant, and the villages typically utilize diesel generators. Which climate hazards are most concerning for energy infrastructure? For Suriname's infrastructure in general, the most concerning hazards are increases in precipitation, high winds, and sea level rise. Additionally, energy infrastructure is vulnerable to increases in temperature and climate hazards such as flooding, storms, and irregular water levels, as water levels are particularly important for the hydropower plant. We will now explore some of the ways climate impacts would affect energy infrastructure in Suriname through various impact chains or pathways. I know this is a busy diagram, so I encourage you to pause the video and read some of the pathways. You can begin by looking at any of the blue boxes, which represent climate impacts. These lead to intermediate impacts, which are in the gray boxes, and then the final or downstream risks, which are in the red boxes. Yellow boxes show who or what may be exposed to the risk, and green boxes show factors that might increase vulnerability. So I encourage you to pause and look at some of the different pathways. Now that you've hopefully looked at some of the pathways, I will highlight a few that are key for energy infrastructure. Let's start by looking at the more temperature climate hazard. So this is increased temperature. Increased temperature in Suriname can affect energy infrastructure in several ways. So increased temperature by itself, or when combined with less precipitation and droughts, leads to less water availability for energy production and cooling. And this is significant for hydropower plants because it can mean less energy output or less power. Something important to note here is that if hydropower plants are producing less power, thermal power plants may increase generation to make up for that lost power from hydropower plants. But if this occurs during a time when energy is in high demand, for example, people are trying to stay cool, this can increase the occurrence of blackouts and cause higher maintenance and energy costs. So let's look at some of the other pathways of more temperature. So more or increased temperature can also, as I kind of mentioned, increase energy demands for cooling. So if it's very hot, people want to stay cool and use air conditioning if they have it. Increased temperatures can also lead to algal blooms, so algae growing in hydroelectric dams, which requires more maintenance. And finally, increased temperatures can decrease the thermal efficiency of thermoelectric power plants. This can result in reduced power output and additional fuel consumption, leading to overall higher energy prices. Similar to the more temperature climate hazard, less precipitation can lead to drought conditions and less water availability for the hydropower plant, which has the same downstream impacts as the more temperature pathways did. Finally, if we move to the right of our diagram here, a number of different climate variables and hazards can lead to loss or damage of energy infrastructure, for example, transmission poles or electricity facilities. These climate hazards include more precipitation and flooding, higher winds leading to more fires and more waves, and sea level rise leading to more waves, flooding, and coastal erosion. So all of these different factors and climate hazards can lead to loss and damage of energy infrastructure. What are some of the downstream impacts or consequences of the pathways that we just explored? Any impact on the ability to generate power or electricity, or any interruption in the supply chain can lead to higher energy prices and energy insecurity, so not having reliable energy for both on and off-grid areas. Off-grid areas have to adapt by providing more fuel or fuel-powered electricity generators, or by shifting to alternative means of energy generation, such as solar panels, which can be more expensive. Loss and damage of energy infrastructure and assets may also lead to financial losses, for example, if there have to be repairs to the damage, and it can also pose a health risk, even resulting in loss of life. Who or what would be more exposed to these impacts? In Suriname, people living on a densely packed coast are more exposed to certain climate hazards, for example, sea level rise, flooding, and more wave action and erosion. Additionally, people living close to power plants that are already at or close to their power output or limit may also be more exposed to energy insecurity and higher energy prices. Finally, what can increase vulnerability to these downstream impacts? Energy infrastructure that is outdated, poorly maintained, or scarce can increase people's risk or vulnerability to these downstream impacts. Rural districts are typically supplied by older infrastructure that lacks the ability to recover from power failures. Let's explore a case study related to energy infrastructure. Meet Marta. She lives on the coast of Paramaribo. Recently, Paramaribo experienced a heat wave, meaning several days where temperatures were over 30 degrees Celsius, and it also hasn't rained in a few months. The combination of hot temperatures and little precipitation has resulted in lower water levels and less water inflow for the Afobaka hydropower plant, meaning less energy has been produced. In addition, due to hot temperatures, people are trying to stay cool, and the energy demand across Paramaribo has increased. Energy prices are increasing, and people are worried there may be a blackout. Marta is worried about if the electricity suddenly shuts off, and she wonders how she will stay cool and take care of herself if it does.